Good afternoon time. I'm going to get started. We have a lot to cover today. My name is Erica DeReyes. Welcome to Navigating Unconscious Bias to Promote Inclusion. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First is, this is a webinar, and as a result, you are all muted, number one, and also your video is not running. So I can't see you and I can't hear you. However, you can communicate with me via the Q&A button. You'll see it either at the top of your screen or the bottom of the screen. At any point during the presentation, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box. It is anonymous. No one else will be able to see your question. And I've saved a couple of minutes at the end to answer these questions. Also, this session is being recorded so that if you want to watch it again, if you want to share it with anyone, it will be available on my website, and I'll tell you at the end how to get there. So a brief introduction about myself for those of you who don't know me. I am an attorney, and I spent most of my career as an employee relations director at a Fortune 500 company. I now own my own consulting company, Employee Relations Consulting, where I provide proactive resources in training, consulting, and executive coaching. I was inspired to start my company because I believe that we need to empower leaders, as often individuals are promoted to positions of leadership without any leadership or people training. I believe in empowering leaders with basic employment law knowledge, as well as critical subjects, such as workplace civility, and today's topic, unconscious bias. So this is an abbreviated version of an interactive session I give to client groups. Today's session will not be as interactive because the purpose is to share as much information with you as possible in these 30 minutes. In response to the tragedy of George Floyd and others, we must all become more aware of the impact of our actions, both conscious and unconscious. Unconscious bias training alone is not the only answer to combat racism and inequality, but I do think it's a critical part that we must understand. The goal for today's training is twofold. One is to gain awareness, and two is to take action. So today I'm hopeful that you will both gain awareness and gain tools so you can take action. All right, so let's get started. I'm sharing my screen with you so you can see the PowerPoint in front of you. Navigating unconscious bias to promote inclusion. In today's presentation, again, the first part is going to be gaining awareness. So we're going to start with talking about what is unconscious bias and why should we care about it. So we are subjected to over 10 million bits of data at a time, and that data can be auditory, visual, physical, yet our brains can only process 40 bits of data. So we're going from millions of bits of information coming at us at a time in our unconscious and consciously only able to process 40. As a result, our brain's neurons create shortcuts based on our experiences and knowledge in the past to help us make decisions quicker. Where did these shortcuts come from? It is a survival instinct. If you think about it, if you see this lion coming towards you and you had to take the time to consciously process and think through, it's a four-legged animal, it's hairy, it's coming towards me, you may be dead by the time your conscious process it. So when we see things, again, the fight or flight, we can instantly process and instantly make a decision. It's important to understand about unconscious bias. It's something that we all have. You might hear some people say, well, I'm not biased, I don't have unconscious bias. Well, you do, because it's a survival instinct. The problem is what we're turning to next. And that is, why do we care so much about unconscious bias? And I'd like to start the why by giving you an definition, explanation that I like to use because I really think it breaks it down into the most fundamental understanding. So first, it's snap judgments, which is what we just talked about. It's those quick, unconscious decisions, fight or flight, that result from these shortcuts or pre-existing knowledge structures in our brains that make us very efficient at interpreting incoming information quickly below our level of conscious awareness about what or who we see. These judgments, or snap judgments, tell us who or what is likable, safe, valuable, right, or competent. They're influenced by our experiences. They affect our objective observations, and they impact how we see people. And this is the crux of the problem with unconscious bias. These are snap judgments that are influencing how we see people. Usually when I do this training with groups, I'll spend a lot of time on this slide and we'll go through a lot of these terms and explain why it can be a problem. For today's purpose, I just want to get right to the heart of the matter. The last statement, they impact how we see people. And what's the first thing that you see when you see people? You see race, you see gender, you see age. All of these are considered protected categories under the law. If you make decisions as a result of these protected categories, it's called discrimination under the law. So as a result, we want to make sure that we are not making snap judgments because of someone's protected category, race, gender, age. And a quick side note, I usually in my live training like to play music and see who can remember these images and where they come from. Some people will tell me it's from the Dove soap ad, but most people are quick to remember that these are the faces from Michael Jackson's Black or White video, where the individuals turn their heads and they morph into one another. And I think it's a beautiful statement in how we are all part of humanity. We just all come in different shapes and sizes and colors, and to celebrate that. So there's multiple kinds of, I think about 12 kinds of bias, unconscious bias, with all different terms, and we're not going to get into them today. Today, I just want to hit on the highlights. One area of bias that we specifically see when it comes to stereotyping individuals is confirmation bias. And you'll see this Gary Larson Far Side cartoon on the right that pretty much sums up what confirmation bias is. And the problem with confirmation bias is that we instantly categorize people. We assign all attributes of that category, the gender, race, age, to that individual. And we notice the information that confirms our expectations and vice versa. And so then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think in the workplace, we have seen examples of this, right? We don't want to hire someone who's older because they're not good with technology. We don't want to promote the woman into the position where she has to travel because she has young kids or whatever it may be. But then we continue to notice those things about that individual. So we confirm what we think we know. And then the individual doesn't get that opportunity. And so that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. So confirmation bias is just one type of unconscious bias that really impacts people in the workplace. So one of the reasons why we need to care about unconscious bias is because it has the result of discriminating against people. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this study that was done by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And the study was titled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakisha and Jamal?" So essentially what happened here is they took one resume with all the same information on it. All they did on the resume was change the names. They had half the resumes, they put Emily and Greg as the name. And the other half of the resumes, they put Lakisha and Jamal on as the names. And as many of you know, the unfortunate result was that Emily and Greg got more callbacks than Lakisha and Jamal. What I want to do with you really briefly is a quick poll question. So it's going to come up on your screen, and I'd like you to answer, how much more likely were Emily and Greg to get an interview over Lakisha and Jamal? So I'm just going to give you a minute to vote, and then I'm going to share the results with you. All right, here we go. We got, most people have responded, so I'm going to share the results. So the answer that got most responses is 75%, which it seems like that would be the case as of late. It actually is 50%, and I think 50% is ridiculously high. And I think what is surprising about this study is that it was done in 2003. And you know, it wasn't even done in the 50s or the 60s where you think there would be more outright prejudice or discrimination. This was done in 2003. And so it just goes to show, I would guess anyone who was reviewing resumes at the time would have told you they weren't prejudiced and they don't discriminate. And they didn't even realize they were doing it. Again, unconscious bias. Thank you all for participating in the poll. That's the last thing you'll have to do proactively today. Again, normally I do a lot more interaction, but in the interest of time, I'm trying to get you as much knowledge in the shortest amount of time. So again, we have gained an awareness right now. Hopefully all of you understand what unconscious bias is, and hopefully also you know why is it important and why should we care about it. First of all, we want to prevent discrimination. As we just saw, unconscious bias can end in discrimination. But also the title of this presentation is we want to promote inclusion. And I want to just take a minute to talk about inclusion. So as many of you know, organizations across the country have D&I, diversity and inclusion initiatives, and they run the gamut and they're very prolific and it's wonderful. And it's where we need to be and where we need to go, but we need to do better, because far too often, so many organizations are checking the box on diversity, but they're not checking the box on inclusion. So what does this mean? So diversity is having diverse individuals of diverse backgrounds, ages, genders, races in your workplace. So that's easy. Diversity, get diverse people in. I mean, not everyone is good at that, but that's kind of the first step. The second step is inclusion. And that is, you have diverse individuals in your organization, but do they feel valued? Do they feel heard? And do they feel respected? Are they in leadership positions at your organization? So diversity means nothing without inclusion, in my mind. And I think that's what you're going to see more of this, is this real focus on inclusion. Once we have people in our organizations, how do we make sure they feel included? I am going to show you something in a minute, but I wanted to also just share the analogies that many of you have probably already heard, and that is diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. Likewise, diversity is being given a seat at the table, and inclusion is being asked to speak at the table. So it's very important, that distinction between diversity and inclusion, and it's very important that organizations are making sure they're getting people included. And we're gonna, not only because it prevents discrimination, it's the right thing to do, but actually it makes business sense, and I want to show you why from a financial perspective. So there was a McKinsey study that was done in 2017, and they looked at 366 public companies, and they sorted them by their executive teams, and they took the most diverse executive teams, and they looked at the top 20% compared to the whole group. They looked at the top 28% of executive teams for ethnic and racial diversity, and the top 25% for gender diversity. And what they found at these the most diverse executive teams were more likely to have financial returns above the industry mean. So you'll see here, the ethnic and racial diversity, they were 33% more likely to have financial returns above the industry mean, and gender diversity were 21% more likely. And I just want to quickly show you, this is a graphical representation from McKinsey that shows on the left side of the screen the gender diversity, the right side the ethnic diversity, and the difference and the improvement. The more diverse, the more profitable. And I think this goes to the idea that when you studies, and I can't get into all of them right now, have shown over the years that the more diverse perspectives and experiences people bring to the table, better decisions are made, better organizations, more successful teams occur, versus the groupthink that you want to avoid by having all the same people thinking all the same way. Okay, so we've talked about gaining awareness on what unconscious bias is and why it's so important that we make sure we try to prevent it. This next part is about taking action. So you know what it is, and now what can you do about it? And I'm going to tell you what to do, how you can prevent it, both within yourself and how organizations can help prevent unconscious bias. Also, at the end of this, I'm going to give you a tool for you to customize to create your own free training if you so choose. I think it's important to make sure that everyone has access to this information and people are not able to share this information as a result of any financial limitation. Okay. So for you as an individual, the first thing that you need to do to help prevent unconscious bias in yourself is to gain awareness. And hopefully you've done that now through this training. Another thing that you can do is a self-assessment. And that is something you can actually do for free online. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Project Implicit. So implicit bias, it means unconscious bias. It's another term, technical term. And so in this Project Implicit is a free resource from Harvard, and the website is right there, implicit.harvard.edu. And you can go on and take many different tests. You can take an IAT test on racism, sexism, ageism, all sorts of things. And I think it's interesting exercise to go through if you want to test yourself and see where your potential biases may be. Another thing that you can do, and I think is so important to stress, is just slow down. Slow down when you're making any decisions that impact people, and just think for a moment, you know, am I doing this because it's familiar and easy? Am I doing it and make sure it's the right decision now? This is easier said than done. We are all more busy than ever. We don't have time to slow down. And when it comes especially to people issues in organizations, it's always, you know, I just feel like it's hard to keep up. But if you can just slow down, because as we know now, unconscious bias happens when our brains make those quick snap judgments. But if we bring that to our conscious in the forefront of our brain, hopefully it'll help us be more thoughtful in our decision making. So that's what you can do as an individual. But now let's look at what organizations can do. And I think it's important, it's so critical for organizations to take action, because you have human beings making employment decisions, and human beings have unconscious bias. And so what sort of things can organizations put in place to try to eliminate unconscious bias as best they can? So the first thing is, and we're going to go into each of these in more detail, I'm just going to give you 3 buckets. Having structured processes, having standardized criteria, and using panels. The point of all 3 of these things is that they eliminate subjectivity, and that's where the problems lie. So let's start with candidate selection. So this is obviously an issue. We just talked about the resume example. Something that we're seeing organizations do, and let me back up for a second just to say that these recommendations it won't work for everyone. There are some large companies that are able to institute some of these practices, and some small organizations can't, or vice versa. These are just suggestions, and any action that you can take to improve things at all is better than no action or inaction. So let's back to candidate selection. There is a trend, and many of you may have seen, to remove names off resumes, and the reason is obvious. From a name, you can deduce gender, ethnicity, also photos, same thing, age, and dates. And dates really goes to the age thing. So if you can determine someone's age, obviously by the dates of their college graduation. Now, not always true, it's still an issue to be aware of. So if there's any way that you can remove any of this information before it's given to the decision maker, so that they're really looking at job responsibilities and the position in question, not at factors that are irrelevant. It doesn't matter, any of this stuff, your name, your photo, the dates you went to college are irrelevant. Frankly, it's all about the responsibilities of the job. Another thing that organizations can do is standardize interview questions. The interview is a huge place where bias comes into play, and I think we all have been in the situation where we'll have one interview where it's a nice conversation and we get to know the person. We'll have another interview where it's questions about the job and job-specific interview questions. And the problem with the conversational interview, if it truly doesn't hit on the job at all, is that that's where the bias can come in. And what I mean by this example I like to give is, let's say you go into an interview and you spend the whole time talking about Texas A&M football, and the interviewer also went to Texas A&M, and they love you, and they're like, great, we can talk about football. I feel like I could hang out with this person. Maybe they'll come to a game with me. That's not helpful, right? The issue here is called affinity bias. So we're more likely to choose people who are like us. We naturally have an affinity for them. And that's the whole issue with unconscious bias, is we're trying to not make those automatic judgments on who is likable, but who can best do the job. And by standardizing questions, if you have a set of questions that are job related and focus on the position at hand, it helps eliminate the bias of the interviewer. I think, some people will criticize this and say, well, it's pretty generic to have standardized questions for each person that's interviewing. The person has the same question, but I think there should be core questions that everyone should ask, and then you can still have a conversation to still get to know the person. Hiring decisions, again, standardized criteria and panels. And this is because we want to have panels always, only because if you have one decision maker, you don't know what their bias may be. If you have multiple decision makers, it helps eliminate the bias by having different perspectives, hopefully. Next is performance evaluations and promotion decisions. So this is a huge roadblock sometimes to inclusion. The idea that we're promoting individuals with diversity to positions where they have influence, their voice can be heard. In all of these situations, performance evaluations, promotion decisions, we really want to make sure we have a structured process and people know how to get promoted, standardized criteria by which we judge the candidates, not just because we like someone. And finally, panels. If there's a way to have multiple individuals involved in someone's career development, I think we all know there's those bad managers that may keep someone down and hold them back from really growing. Yet they're the only one who gives them an evaluation and that makes the decisions. So there's not really anywhere for that person to go, and that can be a problem, and that can be corrected if there's multiple people. Again, if practical, it's not always practical. Okay, as I mentioned, this is a free resource available to anybody who wants to give their own unbiasing. Google calls it unbiasing. Rework.com, Google has a department called People Analytics, and they just focus on people development issues, and they have a fantastic resource regarding unconscious bias. And I'm just gonna, let's see if I have time to quickly show you. Yeah, I have time to quickly show you the website where you can go and you can create your own training, and there's resources on here. Now I can also do the training for you, but I want to make sure that people have options and they're not limited for any budgetary reasons. So here's the website I was just talking with you about. I'm going to have a link to this on my website, to link to Google from my website, or you can just write this down and find it on your own. But what they do is they have a whole, I mean, all the information we just talked about is here, but they have these guides at the bottom. And the one where the training is here under Hold Everyone Accountable. And on the left here, it says, give your own unbiasing workshop. Click on that, and here's a tool. So Google understands the significance and importance of this topic, and so they have it right here. Create your own customized tool using their work slides, and they have a facilitator guide here. So when you have time, go back. I highly encourage you to check this out. Also, they have the ability on one of the other tabs, I'm not going to go into now, you can watch. They give it all of their associates, and the whole entire organization gets this training upon hire, and they have the 1-hour video of that training you can watch for free online. Let's go back. Okay. Okay, so to wrap up, unconscious bias, we all have it. Our brains were designed to create shortcuts as a survival instinct, and these shortcuts do have negative outcomes. We must be aware. We must check ourselves before we make decisions. Education is key. As I mentioned, the goal for today's training was to gain awareness and take action. So hopefully you've gained awareness, and now you have some tools to take action, even if it's just slowing down and being aware, small things that we can all do to have impact. And evaluate and standardize processes. So you've got the human element in all decisions at organizations. So if people decisions are left up to people, frankly, who have subjectivity, bias can result. So as much as you can put those processes and procedures in place, it will benefit you and your organization. So thank you so much for your time. It looks like we have 2 more minutes. Here's my name, my email, my phone number. Reach out if you need help with anything. I'm going to go to the Q&As and see if we have any questions. And it was a pleasure spending time with you. Thank you so much. There actually are no questions. So again, on my website, I'll have a recording if you're interested, and feel free to reach out with questions at any time. And that's it. And thank you all so much for your time.